Are you ready? Let's go!
Don't you sometimes just want to talk about everything? You know, there's days when you can just talk about anything. Need to sit back and chat about nothing at all? Nothing But Julie, coming at you with fun and creative topics and interviews.
Did you hear Julie's podcast? She's got the greatest topics.
Come join the chat about everything, anything, and nothing. So unwind and tune in to Nothing But Julie. Great topics and cool interviews with some pretty awesome people. And now, without further delay, here's Nothing But Julie.
Well, hello there. Welcome. This is Julie Schrager. I am your host of the Nothing But Julie podcast, and welcome to Tuesday's Tale. I want to first off say thank you so very much to all of my listeners. I did not expect my podcast to take off like it did. And, you know, sometimes it's kind of hard to tell how many listeners you have without checking all the analytics. And so I sometimes depend on feedback. And I have received such incredible feedback, not only for my regular podcast, but for the narration short stories series. Some people have sent me DMs and emails, and it's just been nothing but an incredible response. There are people who actually really do like hearing these short stories. Some listen on their way back from work, or when they are going out shopping, or even at home at night, to settle them down, which is so incredible. I never knew that I had that type of a voice. I always thought that I was, the typical New Yorker with that kind of accent. And so I want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart. It's been a wild ride so far, and I hope to continue doing it. So with that, today I am going to be reading you. Now hold on to your seats. Don't let go just yet. I am going to be reading to you a fable by Walter Crane, and you might recall the name of it, which is called The Frog Prince. I wanted to find a children's book that had a moral to the story that also was something that would be a moral of the story also for adults. I have found over the years working at a school for 12 years that it's actually children's books that have the best morals. And more like fables. And I mentioned this in my last Tuesday's Tale. I love the endings where it teaches a lesson when you don't realize that it's kind of creeping up on you. So with that, I present to you The Frog Prince by Walter Crane. And again, special thanks to Project Gutenberg for having so many copyright expired books that I can find and give to you. Their website is www.gutenberg.org, and I will also have that information on my Instagram and my Facebook account. So here we go, The Frog Prince. little bit of a frog in my throat. I cracked myself up. Okay. The Frog Prince. Make myself laugh. In the olden time, when wishing was having, there lived a king whose daughters were all beautiful, but the youngest was so exceedingly beautiful that the sun himself, although he saw her very often, was enchanted every time she came out into the sunshine. Near the castle of this king was a large and gloomy forest, and in the midst stood an old lime tree, beneath whose branches splashed a little fountain, so whenever it was very hot, the king's youngest daughter ran off into this wood and sat down by the side of this fountain, and when she felt dull, would often divert herself by throwing a golden ball up in the air and catching it. And this was her favorite amusement. Now, one day it happened that this golden ball, when the king's daughter threw it into the air, did not fall down into her hand, but on the grass, and then it rolled past her into the fountain. The king's daughter followed the ball with her eyes, but it disappeared beneath the water, which was so deep that no one could see to the bottom. Then she began to lament and to cry louder and louder. And as she cried, a voice called out, "Why weepest thou, O king's daughter? Thy tears would melt even a stone to pity." And she looked around to the spot whence the voice came, and saw a frog stretching his thick, ugly head out of the water. "Ah, you old water paddler," she said, "was it you that spoke? I am weeping for my golden ball, which has slipped away from me into the water." "Be quiet and do not cry," answered the frog. "I can give thee good advice, but what wilt thou give me if I fetch thy plaything up again?" "What will you have, dear frog?" said she. "My dresses, my pearls and jewels, or the golden crown which I wear?" The frog answered, "Dresses or jewels or golden crowns are not for me, but if thou wilt love me, and let me be thy companion and playfellow, and sit at thy table, and eat from thy little golden plate, and drink out of thy cup, and sleep in thy little bed, if thou wilt promise me all these, then will I dive down and fetch up thy golden ball." "Oh, I will promise you all," said she, "if you will only get me my ball." But she thought to herself, "What is the silly frog chattering about? Let him remain in the water with his equals. He cannot mix in society." But the frog, as soon as he had received her promise, drew his head under the water and dived down. Presently he swam up again with the ball in his mouth and threw it on the grass. The king's daughter was full of joy when she again saw her beautiful plaything, and, taking it up, she ran off immediately. "Stop, stop," cried the frog. "Take me with thee. I cannot run as thou canst." But all his croaking was useless. Although it was loud enough, the king's daughter did not hear it, but, hastening home, soon forgot the poor frog, who was obliged to leap back into the fountain. The next day, when the king's daughter was sitting at table with her father and all his courtiers, and was eating from her own little golden plate, something was heard coming up the marble stairs. Splish splash, splish splash. And when it arrived at the top, it knocked at the door, and a voice said, "Open the door, thou youngest daughter of the king." So she rose and went to see who it was that called her. But when she opened the door and caught sight of the frog, she shut it again with great vehemence and sat down at the table looking very pale. But the king perceived that her heart was beating violently, and asked her whether it was a giant who had come to fetch her away, who stood at the door. "Oh, no," she said, "it is no giant, but an ugly frog." "What does the frog want with you?" said the king. "Oh, dear father, when I was sitting yesterday playing by the fountain, my golden ball fell into the water, and this frog fetched it up again, but I cried so much. But first I must tell you, he pressed me so much that I promised he should be my companion. I never thought that he could come out of the water, but somehow he has jumped out, and now he wants to come in here." At that moment there was another knock, and a voice said, "King's daughter, youngest, open the door. Hast thou forgotten thy promises made at the fountain so clear, 'neath the lime tree's shade? King's daughter, youngest, open the door." Then the king said, "What you have promised that you must perform. Go and let him in." So the king's daughter went and opened the door, and the frog hopped in after her, right up to the chair. And as soon as she was seated, the frog said, "Take me up." But she hesitated so long that at last the king ordered her to obey. And as soon as the frog sat on the chair, he jumped onto the table and said, "Now push thy plate near me, that we may eat together." And she did so, but as everyone saw, very unwillingly. The frog seemed to relish his dinner much, but every bit that the king's daughter ate nearly choked her, till the last frog said, "I have satisfied my hunger and feel very tired. Wilt thou carry me upstairs now into thy chamber, and make thy bed ready, that we may sleep together?" At this speech the king's daughter began to cry, for she was afraid of the cold frog and dared not touch him. And besides, he actually wanted to sleep in her own beautiful, clean bed. But her tears only made the king very angry, and he said, "He who helped you in the time of your trouble must now be despised." So she took the frog up with her 2 fingers and put him in a corner of her chamber. But as she lay in her bed, he crept up to it and said, "I am so very tired that I shall sleep well. Do take me up, or I will tell thy father." This speech put the king's daughter in a terrible passion, and catching the frog up, she threw him with all her strength against the wall, saying, "Now will you be quiet, you ugly frog." But as he fell, he was changed from a frog into a handsome prince with beautiful eyes, who, after a little while, became, with her father's consent, her dear companion and betrothed. Then he told her how he had been transformed by an evil witch, and that no one but herself could have had the power to take him out of the fountain, and that on the morrow they would go together into his own kingdom. The next morning, as soon as the sun rose, a carriage drawn by 8 white horses with ostrich feathers on their heads and golden bridles drove up to the door of the palace, and behind the carriage stood the trusted Henry, the servant of the young prince. When his master was changed into a frog, trusty Henry had grieved so much that he had bound 3 iron bands round his heart, for fear it should break with grief and sorrow. But now that the carriage was ready to carry the young prince to his own country, the faithful Henry helped in the bride and bridegroom, and placed himself in the seat behind, full of joy at his master's release. They had not proceeded far when the prince heard a crack, as if something had broken behind the carriage. So he put his head out of the window and asked Henry what was broken, and Henry answered, "It was not the carriage, my master, but a band which I bound round my heart when it was in such grief because you were changed into a frog." Twice afterwards on the journey there was the same noise, and each time the prince thought it was some part of the carriage that he had given away, but it was only the breaking of the bands which bound the heart of the trusty Henry, who was thenceforward free and happy. The end. What do you guys think? Do you understand what this was about? Do you understand the moral of the story? Take a minute if you want to, to think about it. I think that one of the themes of this fable is, well, the primary theme is keeping your promises. And it's a great lesson to teach our children, to teach students, and especially adults, because I think that many adults tend to forget things that they might have been taught when they were young, or maybe they were never taught it. Here you have the princess who's trying to back out of this promise that she made to this frog who got her treasure, her golden ball. But it was her father who insisted upon her keeping her promise to maintain, I guess, her integrity. And as a result, the princess ends up with her prince. Now, throwing the frog into the wall doesn't seem to be something that, you would do with keeping your promise. I would think making the frog comfortable and doing what it says, which is what the agreement was, is one thing. I don't know why they put that part in there. I'm sure there's a reason. But what does it really teach us in the end? Obviously, it is about promises, but what do you think that the frog symbolizes? I feel like I'm an English teacher or a reading teacher, but I love finding symbolism in things. And I think that The Frog Prince is a really, really great fable, a short fable to teach people how they need to treat others. You can't just make a promise and just walk away. But look at how she did keep her promise, although she was hesitant and didn't want to, and it was her father that made her do it. I think that this is kind of what life is about. I think that most people are ill prepared to keep their promises, say things at the time, and then make up excuses as to, as to why they can't keep their promises. And I've found this often throughout my life. I do think also that there are certain morals that to certain stories that might have been written a long time ago that really don't pertain to today. This is one of them, especially a lot of the Dr. Seuss books that I think really represent children and adults. And it's a great avenue to, when you're reading to your children, it reminds you of goodness and wholeness. It's not okay, I'm just going to say this, and you might not agree, but I also think that it's not totally immoral. I also think that it's how women might be treated, that they should remain subservient and remain obedient to men in a very small fraction. Because with that, you have the father who's holding his morals up and saying, no, you have to keep your promises. So I'm kind of like, going back and forth with how I feel totally about it. There's always a lesson in a fable or in fairy tales. And I think that we're also talking about 19th century writing versus 21st century, where, wow, a lot has changed for the better, I think. But I do think that the best thing that you can take away from this particular story is when you make a promise, even if it's something you don't want to do, you have to remember why you made that promise. Okay? And you have to remember that whether you want to do it or not, it is still a promise, and it's meaningful to the other person that you promised to. So when you read this particular fable, you can appreciate what it means in the end. So basically, guys, don't just make a promise or say something that you think is going to help in that moment. It's important to keep that promise, whether you want to do it or not. Because you know what? In the end, it's only going to make you a better person. And sometimes you don't always need to do something like in a barter system. How great is it when you do something when there's no strings attached and you just did it because of the kindness of your heart, especially in this world. So anyway, I'm probably talking more than I did reading, but it's a really great lesson for you, for your children. I do hope you enjoyed it, and I will be doing another one for next week. And don't forget, tune in, because I do have every week not only a Tuesday's Tale, but I also have either an interview or I discuss another topic. So you get 2 podcasts a week, usually, always on Tuesdays. And Wednesday or Thursday is when my next one comes out. And feel free to go to my Instagram and Facebook page at Nothing But Julie. You'll see all my information there on how you can touch base with me, leave feedback, and even subscribe to my podcast. So thanks again for joining, and happy Tuesday.